With so much talk about hacking and the last presidential election, I wanted to make a video addressing it. I was watching a live broadcast on YouTube today of a hearing where there was testimony being given and questions asked about the Russia hacking conspiracy. Many people participating were speaking from a perspective of Russian hacking being established already and that the election was hacked. I want to backpedal the conversation a bit and focus on the evidence and try to lay out, to the best of my understanding, some basics of cybersecurity for people who maybe don't know much about computers and computer networks. I also want to visit a few other facts along the way and try to keep my opinion or views of politicians and politics out. I know these kind of things are difficult to follow. Many people have a short attention span, so I'll try to go as fast as I possibly can and stick to the point as much as possible. So to start with, I would just like to point out that when you are speaking about government agencies and governments hacking, you are speaking about tens of thousands of people with billions and billions of dollars in budget annually and extreme expertise in their area of computer science. Even the lone hackers and small hacker groups accomplish a lot with a very little in resources, so keep that in mind when forming your opinions here. So to begin the discussion, I want to discuss what it means to hack an election, since the term is thrown around a lot. Really, when people say that, they are referring to extremely different things. One implication is that information was leaked about one party to aid the other. Others imply this means working with one party on campaign strategy. Some people have said that votes may have been tampered with. So, to narrow this down a little bit, since nobody notable and reputable has testified under oath, so far that I am aware, that voting machines were tampered with, and since rumors of collusion also do not seem to have been substantiated by anyone under oath that is reputable, I'm focusing on the main thing that seems to have kick-started this whole Russia hacking thing, which is the idea that one party's information was leaked to the public in order to aid the opposing party. So something important to note is that there is more than one way information can escape. It could be willingly leaked by responsible parties on purpose for various reasons, such as framing someone else or painting themselves as a victim. Though this would normally be unlikely if the information is unflattering, you just don't know. Sometimes someone may be strategizing and just make a bad strategy. An example of this would be a celebrity that might leak nude photos or a sex tape because this drums up publicity, and while pretending to be a victim, they get sympathy. So it helps their career possibly, or it might backfire on them. But that's one example of a reason why someone might actually leak on themselves and try to make it look like it was someone else. Information could be leaked by an insider who's been granted access and is legally accessing the information, but does not have the consent of others involved to release that information. And this could be done for various reasons, such as being disgruntled, feeling that the information is important for the public to have, or in exchange for money, like giving it to a competitor in order, for a big payday. Another way is hacking, which is the nature of this, or the topic of this video, which would be, to define it, gaining access to or compromising a system, computer system or network without permission for the purpose of doing something illegal, like stealing information or using that system to carry out other crimes, is what hacking would be. And you can kind of Google that to get maybe a more professional definition, but that's the definition I'm working with. So starting off saying so-and-so hacked, so my question is, skips right past the idea that the information could have been leaked from the inside, either willingly or unwillingly, within an organization or by a person. What hacks are said to have taken place? The implication is that two batches of emails, the first from the Democratic National Committee and the second from the Hillary Clinton campaign, specifically her campaign manager, John Podesta, were taken and were conveyed by some means to an organization called WikiLeaks, and then subsequently published on WikiLeaks' website to the public. WikiLeaks is well known for this sort of activity, publishing information that would typically be deemed important information for the public to get their hands on, and they publish such information about companies, governments, and or individuals all around the world, not just confined to the USA. I'm going to try to break down how information can be stolen and how that information can be tracked and what obstacles there are. If you reported to police that your computer had been hacked, there will be several steps involved in that investigation. First, they would have to check your personal devices for evidence of hacking. They might need to contact your internet service provider, with your permission of course, to pull logs of your internet activities, and through this they can gather enough to go to the next step. So this is kind of the victim side of collection of evidence. It would normally be the first part of an investigation, unless by chance the police just so happen to already be investigating something and they just stumbled across that hacking, and then when you report it they would already have a place to start from. But say the police are completely unaware, or the FBI is completely unaware, you report a hacking and they're going to investigate it, they're going to start with you to get evidence to then move to the next step, like following a trail of breadcrumbs. So once they've collected that evidence that someone indeed hacked you, typically the next step would be to see where the data went to or where the connection was coming from. And in order to put a name on it, law enforcement have to find the internet service provider for that guilty person, the network of origin basically. So say the person who hacked you has AT&T internet service, DSL at home, then they find out that data is going back to AT&T's network to an internet connection there. Then they have to go to that internet service provider and give them a subpoena ordering the service provider to give them the information. They can't just go to AT&T and say, hey, fork over the data. A judge, just like a warrant, has to issue a subpoena to provide information about a criminal proceeding. And then once the subpoena is received, then the company can begin to release the information that was requested of them. And once the police review that information that they've gained through the subpoena, they know the name usually that's associated with the account and the address at which the internet service is provided, or something similar. If it was through a cellular carrier, then they would have the name and address of the person who it's being billed to, etc., and they could follow that up. So then law enforcement would have to go back to a judge, get a warrant to go to the location where that internet service is installed, or to the location of the person who purchased the internet service, and then they would be able to go in and collect the final bit of information, which would be then the criminal side of it. They would get their network equipment, electronic devices, computers, tablets, phones, whatever, and then search those devices for evidence that that person was carrying out hacking activity. So those are just kind of very boiled down basic steps of how this would normally take place in an investigation involving criminal hacking. So communications across computer networks and in between networks, including the internet, use addresses just like the postal address that allow mail to be sent from one home to another home. For computers, these are called IP or Internet Protocol addresses. And to establish end-to-end communications, data has source and destination addresses embedded in them the same way an envelope has the source and destination postal address on the outside. These addresses are temporary and handed out in various ways, such as statically assigned, or an address being assigned on a per-use basis, like when the device connects, it receives an address. When it disconnects, that address goes back into a pool of addresses that can be handed out whenever. So those addresses are the only real thing that you can follow back to and from where the data is going, or where the connection is going. And in most cases, these addresses would be at the point of your internet service provider. So when you have a home modem and you have computers connected to it, all of those devices are sharing that internet connection and therefore sharing that public IP address, whereas the IP addresses that those devices are using inside the network are handed out by the home internet device, or within a business, their network system. So a large corporation could potentially have thousands of devices behind one IP address, and you could have a public Wi-Fi where there are maybe dozens of people all connected to the same Wi-Fi in the same location, but none of them directly tied to that IP address. So there's a little bit of complication that comes in there. Two other things to consider are proxy servers and virtual network connections. So if we go to Wikipedia page about proxy servers, you can see that in networks they are a server that acts as an intermediary for requests from clients seeking resources from other servers. So it's a go-between, a mirror. It sits in between here's Alice, here's Bob in this little diagram, and this is the kind of communication flow that you get. So the proxy is in between. Alice and Bob can't see each other. It's that sort of thing. It's like a mirror where you can't actually see the other side of the reflection. You can like shine a beam of light and it bounces off the mirror to the other person, but the other person can't see where it's coming from. The other thing is virtual private network, VPN, or what I would just refer to generally as virtual network connections. And what these are a connection that is established using security protocols that involve encryption to create a secured connection over an unsecure network. So encryption basically means scrambling information in a way that is not readable by someone who might intercept that data without the key to descramble it. To run credit card transactions, your local convenience mart does this. They purchase a connection to the internet, and then over that connection, which is not entirely secure, they create an encrypted tunnel to the company that is processing the credit card transaction, then send the information like the dollar amount and receive back approval that you do indeed have money in your account to spend, and it authorizes the transaction. Anyone can use these types of connections, and many businessmen and professionals telecommute and access sensitive company records while in remote locations by using such a virtual connection. You can think of it this way, the way that phone systems used to work. At one time, an operator would answer the phone and then say, where do you want to call, and patch you into the next station, and by the time you'd been patched all the way through, there was a literal circuit, a pair of wires that made a loop all the way between you and the receiving end, and then you were connected directly to that other person, and without tapping into the wires, nobody could listen into that phone call. But it was a dedicated circuit, and internet connections don't work that way, but using a VPN is like creating a virtual version of that where you are directly connected to the endpoint. And the most common kind that you would be familiar with in a home environment or in a business environment would likely be a virtual private network, VPN. There are some other protocols out there, other technologies that go by a slightly different name, but it's a virtual network connection is what it is. And it just creates an encrypted tunnel between 2 points over an unsecure network to create a secure or somewhat secure network connection. So without diving into too many specifics, there are three main ways that hackers gain access to systems and devices. One are passwords. A password can be guessed, especially if it is too easy, or some devices may come from the factory with a standard password that the user is expected to change during setup. Many people don't change these. There's some fairly famous exploits that have taken place recently where devices like ovens, refrigerators, thermostats, things within people's homes that are now connected to networks so that the person can control them remotely have been hacked into because the people did not change the default username and password that comes with those devices to something that only they would know. And passwords can also be brute force hacked, and this is by using software that just guesses over and over and over again using various means. Usually they start with a list of common passwords and then move from there to the point of trying actually every combination of letter, number, and symbol until it succeeds. And the difficulty with which they can succeed at that has exactly to do with the complexity of the password and the length of the password. The longer it is, the longer it would take to guess every possible combination. The second are glitches in a system, where an unintended failure of a system might allow someone unintended access if they are aware of this glitch and how to exploit it. Third, the user themselves can be tricked into giving up access to their system. They refer to this as phishing, spelled with a PH instead of an F, and this is like actual phishing in that you use bait to lure a person in. One example might be an email that tells you that you need to change the password to your online account of some kind and gives you a link to where you can change it. But by putting your username and password in at that link to change, you're actually just feeding that information to a hacker. And then it could also be something like a link to a malicious piece of coding, something called viruses, trojans, worms, malware. They go by different names, but they are all roughly the same thing. They are malicious coding or programming that you could get on your system that would allow someone else access to your system, or take your information and send it to them, something of that nature, giving someone access to your things unintentionally without your permission. Another example might be a website that pops up and claims your computer is infected with a virus, and to follow the link and download a program that will remove it, but that program is itself actually a virus and the user infects their own computer. Alright, so with all this information you may begin to see where the problem is, but I will create an example to help understand. Say there was a hacker on a beach in the Bahamas who wanted to hack into a server in the USA while making it look like Russia did it. Obviously they would not use anything personally identifiable to themselves. If anything had to be purchased, it would be done with stolen credit cards or bank accounts and fake personal information or a stolen identity. So this hacker is using public Wi-Fi at the tiki bar on the beach of a hotel down the strip from his own hotel, not obviously dumb enough to use the one where he's currently staying, or where he's made a purchase that would be traceable to him. So they would purchase, using these fake accounts, a reliable VPN service from, say, a company in France. They then create a virtual connection between themselves and the server of the VPN in France, and they are essentially surfing the internet from France. With that tunnel in place, they then purchase proxy services in China, Belgium, and Russia in that order, and connect those servers together to bounce traffic between them. And so then the hacker sets a request out to access the server they want to hack in the USA. So that information travels over the internet to France through that virtual private connection, then bounces off of a server in China, then a server in Belgium, and then a server in Russia, and then goes to that server in the USA. That server, when it's returning information, is going back to its destination that it knows, which is that server in Russia. And when that server in Russia receives it, because it was set up as a proxy server, it knows where the traffic came from and actually forwards it back that direction. It follows the chain right back to that individual. But from the receiving end, from that server in the USA, the only thing they see is the last destination in that link, which would be the proxy server in Russia. So the hacker, connects. They get into the server and they try to access the data. It asks them for a password, and they use a piece of software to sit there and try to hack the password. It tries however many passwords that are common until, oops, one of them just so happens to be the right password, and it lets them in. After gaining access as fast as they can, that hacker is going to download all the information that they can possibly get, and at the same time upload some sort of piece of software to maybe give them backdoor access in a little easier next time. Or in this particular case, they want to make it look like someone else, so they're going to leave a piece of software, a virus or a Trojan, whatever you want to call it, a malicious piece of software that is designed to send information to the IP address of, say, a government server somewhere in Russia. Something like that could happen, and so the perspective of the server that is hacked, when they examine the logs, when they go and they look at that server, all they're going to see is that a connection came from a server in Russia, and that the malicious software on their computer is aimed at something in Russia. Now, to get any further than that, you have to go back to that sort of process that I discussed earlier that would be the standard process if, say, you reported to the police or the FBI that you were hacked and they decided to investigate. So, for those that don't know, a warrant or a subpoena from a court in the USA is worth exactly nothing anywhere else in the world besides the US of A. Even within Europe, with them, many of those countries being part of the EU, they still have difficulties doing law enforcement back and forth between the different countries. But for countries that don't even have those kind of agreements with one another, it's even more ridiculous. So you can imagine this is a really complicated process. Say the FBI began to investigate. They see that the connection came from a server in Russia. So they look into it and they see what internet service provider in Russia is operating the network that connection came from. They could approach that company in Russia that's responsible for it and say, hey, we're doing an investigation into some criminal activity. Will you provide us with the information of the person who's operating this server in Russia? That company in Russia has absolutely no obligation to cooperate. So then that would leave the FBI going to the Russian government or Russian law enforcement agencies directly and saying, hey, we're investigating this. Can you help us? and it's completely up to the other end whether or not they give you any sort of assistance. In a situation like going to a country like Russia or China or somewhere similar where maybe their governments don't have quite the good relationship that maybe, say, the U.S. and UK or the U.S. and Canada or something would have, where they might cooperate pretty freely, you might get stonewalled and never get past that point, or it might take months or years to actually get them to cooperate. But say they get past that point. Say the Russian government intervenes and they do their equivalent of a warrant or a subpoena, and they tell that company in Russia, release that information to them. Well, then you're at the next step of stonewalling. Then you go to the server itself. Well, that's operated by a company that operates proxy servers. So again, you have to approach that company, say, hi, I'm the FBI. I'm investigating this alleged illegal activity that's taken place. Could you provide me with who purchased this service to use this proxy server from you, or whoever the connection came from? Can you give us any information? If they say go on down the river, then you have to go back again to Russian law enforcement and try to cooperate with them to get some sort of arrangement to get that information provided to you. So then you find out, oh, well, that Russian server is actually pointing to another server in China, or another thing in China. You wouldn't even necessarily know it was a server for certain in some situations. So you have to do this same process in every hop, skip, and jump in the connection to work your way back. So then you'd have to go to China. You'd have to repeat this process twice. You'd have to go then to Belgium and get, the Belgian authorities to cooperate, or those companies to cooperate. Then you go to France and you have this company where this connection was established, and finally you get their information, and it leads you back to, again, another country with another set of laws and companies to deal with there. And say you actually get it down to, the connection it came from, and you go to this tiki bar. What is there to find? It's public Wi-Fi. The person was just laying out on the beach. There's no camera records, probably. Most of the time when hackers are caught for stuff like this, it's because of stupid little mistakes that you wouldn't expect a government with billions of dollars of resources and computer intelligence experts out the wazoo to make if they were trying to conduct their own operations or what have you. There's just not usually those kind of mistakes that get ordinary hackers caught. But even then, ordinary hackers are extremely difficult to catch because of these kind of obfuscating circumstances that occur with the way communications can travel over the internet and over private networks. So you could get all the way back to the source of it and still have nothing. If it's public Wi-Fi, if maybe the person connected to an internet connection that's not even public, maybe they hacked into a wireless connection somewhere while driving around through a neighborhood, or they see a Wi-Fi that's not even secured, they'll hop on that and do illegal activities there. So it can be very difficult to track down hackers. Just a simple Google search, how hard is it to track down a hacker? Viewpoint, how hackers are caught out by law enforcement. Catching hackers is not getting easier. Why cyber attacks are so difficult to track back to hackers. Hunting hackers, an ethical hacker explains how to track them down. Why global hackers are nearly impossible to catch. So this could be an interesting one. And I will provide any links in the section below in the description. But just due to the nature of the way that international politics work, it is not a smooth process, is what I'm trying to get to tracking down hackers internationally. A lot of the hackers that are found and are caught are done so with cooperation from cooperative governments, and a lot of times aren't even international hackers. They're hacking from within, the United States or within whatever country that they're in, where they're committing the crime is where they're located. And it makes it easier to catch them, but still, who knows how many statistically commit these crimes and get away with it every year for every one that's caught. It's, I'm sure, a large ratio. You could try to find that information for yourself, but the point being is that tracking down a hacker and being able to point out exactly who that hacker is, even with amateurs, even with people who do not have the resources that a government would have, it's extremely difficult. This example should illustrate how complicated digital forensics is and tracking hacking, how difficult that is. But the crazy thing is, I'm not even really scratching the surface of the kinds of things that hackers can do and manage to get away with, the ways that they can mask their trails. And going back to the statement I made toward the beginning, we are talking about governments, both on the victim side and the perpetrator side here being accused, have who knows how much in their budget for cybersecurity or cyber offense. And you would think that they would be a lot better at covering their trail than what is implied. Like, it's super simple to figure out where it came from. And as well, you would expect the defenses to be a little bit better in these situations where government entities are losing this degree of information, allegedly because of weak passwords or the like. So, going back to the email leaks and the normal way that this sort of crime would be investigated, the DNC say that their email was hacked, and the Hillary Clinton campaign say their email was hacked. So the next step, as I outlined in a normal investigation, would be for a law enforcement agency to investigate, to look at their devices, servers, and internet connection, and look for signs of hacking, and the next step to follow in the chain to follow those breadcrumbs back to the perpetrator, right? Well, did they? The FBI was denied access, per James Comey under oath, to look at those servers. And instead, a third-party company called CrowdStrike was hired to investigate. Now, CrowdStrike generated a report saying that they believed it was the Russians who hacked it and took the emails and then leaked it to WikiLeaks. Part of this report was later retracted, and you can Google more about this yourself. I'm not going to go into all of that. And without going into any details about CrowdStrike itself, this is virtually unheard of behavior. Even if you did hire a private investigator or a company hired a private investigator, almost never does a victim of a crime deny law enforcement access to investigate the crime. I try to think of another situation where that happens. Furthermore, as a closing point, you can investigate for yourself what WikiLeaks is and their reputation. However, WikiLeaks, when asked if it was the Russians that were their source for the emails, said no. This has been established multiple times, and just one example of it is an interview that was done. Here's an article in Fox News Politics where they show a video of the spokesman for WikiLeaks and one of its founders saying that absolutely not, it was not the Russians and it was not any state player. It was another person that did this, either a hacker or they don't name who their sources are, and that's part of their model to protect their sources and to keep people bringing them leaks. They do not name who they're who's providing them with the information. So, reading from that article, he's quoted Julian Assange as saying, "We can say we have said repeatedly that over the last 2 months that our source is not the Russian government and it is not a state party. More than 50,000 emails were released during the 2016 presidential campaign," and I'll stop there in reading the article because then they go into list off the nature of what was in those emails, and I'm not wanting to get into the political part of this, just the facts of it. So, due to the nature of how difficult it is to actually track down a good hacker, especially ones that have the expertise and resources of a government agency, how the investigation was handled or not handled, depending on your perspective, and the fact that the publisher of the information says its source was not Russia, it is my conclusion that when people are saying Russia hacked this or that, they actually have no clue who hacked what or if anything was hacked at all. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this. So I needed to go back in and add just a little bit more to this video. I found an article that is a very, very good article by theintercept.com called "Here's the Public Evidence Russia Hacked the DNC, It's Not Enough." And I also forgot to mention something that's highlighted in this article. One of the parts of this whole theory crafting about Russia and hacking is that there is a concept of digital fingerprints, which would be if I create a piece of software that's designed to break into someone's system, or I'm the only known person who has figured out an exploit that will allow me to break into somebody's system, then if they find evidence of that somewhere else and they don't know of anyone else that's currently using that, then that is a digital fingerprint that I've been involved there. So if they catch me and they get all this evidence gathered up, and then they come back and they see my methods, and they see 10 other crimes that were committed using that same method, and that information is not known to the cybersecurity community, then they would assume that I committed those other 10 crimes. So that's a digital fingerprint linking certain techniques, tactics, code, whatever, to me. However, the problem here is, in this context, that this information has been known before it was used for quite some time in the cybersecurity world, and probably even longer in the world of government agency cybersecurity. I mean, the cutting edge spies and, counter spy tactics that are going on within the government, those elements have probably known even longer about some of this stuff. But once a virus is known and it is public, or an exploit is known and becomes public within the hacker and cybersecurity community, then that's no longer a fingerprint of anything. Anybody can use those techniques until it gets patched, the exploit gets fixed, or antiviruses update and make that virus useless. Anybody can download that virus and then use it. And honestly, that's what a lot of beginner hackers do, is they just download tools other people have created, or download lists of exploits that other people have figured out, download code, viruses, things, and then modify them themselves maybe to send the data back to them, or to something that's going to relay the information to them. So all of these things are only a fingerprint as long as it is exclusive, and none of these things have been shown to be exclusive. In this article itself, it mentions that the first report of some of this malware being used was actually back in 2014. So the usage of this stuff has been out there long enough to not be able to conclusively say that it's tied to Russia. If it was something that only within the government intelligence community it was known that Russians were using these specific techniques and no one else had it, you didn't have forums on the dark side of the internet that were relaying this information back and forth, then you might have a strong case. Something that this article brings up that I think is rather important to note is if you look more closely at a lot of the claims that are made, they use qualifying words: possibly, appears, connects, indicates. It's impossible, or at least dishonest, to present the evidence for Russian responsibility for hacking the Democrats without using language like this. The question then is this: do we want to make major foreign policy decisions with a belligerent nuclear power based on suggestions alone, no matter how strong? I'd say that's pretty important to consider. You really don't want to tangle with someone over something that maybe is not substantiated, much less someone who's very powerful and poses a serious threat to yourself and the world, really. If you're getting into a nuclear power, then everybody's safety is at stake if you start pointing fingers and maybe war starts. So, something to keep in mind. But here's a list that they came together with of all of the known things that cybersecurity firms have published that actually tie this supposed hack to Russia. And most of it, as you can see, is usage of things, like I said, that, as this article covers, are out there. Other people can utilize them. It's not something that only the Russian government's ever been known to use, and only a handful of people within the intelligence community are aware of this cutting-edge hacking that Russia's doing, and then that same hacking fingerprint shows up on the DNC servers. That's not the timeline here. This is stuff that's been out there now. And even worse, some of the metadata from a file that was leaked named off the name of a Russian operative from the Soviet-era secret police, and another document contains Cyrillic, which Cyrillic is the Russian alphabet, or the alphabet of that region of the world, I guess you'd say. And it's the basis for Russian, Ukrainian, and a lot of countries that are former Soviet blocs still speak Russian and even use the Cyrillic alphabet within their own languages, even though it's like an equivalency. They don't maybe use the same words, but they use those characters to spell the words. So, I mean, anybody who speaks Russian could leave that on. It really means nothing is essentially the problem here. Having evidence that a language was used, like for instance, if you found evidence that Spanish was used in a part of a document that was leaked, if you found evidence of Spanish in there, you couldn't say it was the Mexicans that did the hacking or that were related to that document, because anybody, literally anyone, could have done that. Maybe on purpose, to send, someone looking in the wrong direction. So, I don't think it really needs to be emphasized that much, that just finding usage of the Russian alphabet in the metadata of a document really means absolutely nothing. Then the final thing I wanted to point to is a pretty brilliant part of this article. Where basically it highlights, would these groups, again, tens of billions of dollars invested in government agencies with tens of thousands, if not over hundreds of thousands, of agents and spies and everything working on stuff like this throughout multiple agencies in multiple governments, and we're expected to believe that they're dumb enough to leave so many clues. The article says, would these groups be that constantly go back into the environment to change out their implants, modify persistent methods, move to new command and control channels, get caught because they precisely didn't make sure not to use IP addresses they'd been associated with before? It's very hard to buy the argument that the Democrats were hacked by one of the most sophisticated, diabolical foreign intelligence services in history, and that we know this because they screwed up over and over again. That's a very good way of summing up what I was trying to say with this whole video. It just doesn't add up. The level of sophistication that goes into international spying is not going to be caught, typically, because of a bunch of stupid screw-ups. And none of it amounts to evidence of anything. But this article, which will be in the description below, is an extremely good read for anyone that wants to dig a little bit deeper and inform themselves on the subject.